All right, thank you all for the opportunity to be here and to EERI for facilitating the trip. I feel quite honored to have been part of this group to go investigate hospital performance. We went with the purpose of looking at hospitals. We were looking at structural, non-structural performance and functional recovery, and we're going to get into some of those details. So overall, here's a quick overview. I'm not going to spend my 10 minutes looking over this. We'll just get into it. So the purpose, as I mentioned, is to look at hospital structural and non-structural performance, but not just from the structural system. It's actually interesting that of all the hospitals we visited, there was very little structural interest and structural damage that we saw. It was very much focused on the non-structural and the impediments to recovery that are not directly related to the structure. From that, we'll be looking at providing recommendations for future building code and the practice, especially in California, as it relates to the seismic compliance. So one graphic to put up, this is a familiar graphic for many, just to frame the conversation through the performance of these buildings. These are the language that we speak about in terms of hospital performance, ranging from immediate occupancy to life safety, collapse prevention, and unsafe buildings. And we certainly saw the full spectrum. So we looked at base isolated hospitals that provided operational performance. We saw those that provided life-safe building structures, but were not usable. And we unfortunately saw a couple that were complete collapses. So speaking of our hospital team, our group was led by Ali Sumer of HCI, the hospital jurisdiction in California. He was our group leader, our communicator, our facilitator, our negotiator. This took quite a bit of speaking to the local hospital management and staff to get in the door, and Ali is credited with getting that done. We had also of interest, you can read the others on the team, but of interest we brought with Volkan Kara he's a doctor, a surgeon in Turkey. And so we brought, he was along to provide the medical expertise, not only speak the Turkish language, but speak the hospital medical language to facilitate some of those introductions and some of those conversations, which really proved to be invaluable in terms of learning what happened after the earthquake. So as we toured the countryside, I think many of us noticed there's a lot of hospitals. It seemed like they were everywhere, and some of the hospitals we saw were very, very big, and disproportionately so. When we got back, looked at the numbers. This is some of the data in terms of beds per capita. We found some data on California's bed per capita, and it actually turned out to be quite comparable in the end. So interesting data point, but these are the number of hospitals and the population within the affected region. So our team observed more than 23 hospitals. We saw old and new buildings. We saw large and small, government, private, university, fixed base, isolated. We really tried to get a diverse range of buildings. The map that you see is very similar to everyone else's map. We were based in Adana and had long car rides to get out to these individual cities and locations every day. So the observations were done first by internet research. So before we got there, we tried to understand as much as we could from first-hand accounts, from news accounts, from Twitter accounts, from whatever we could find about the hospital performance. We often did drive-bys. We would look at the exterior while our team of Turkish speakers were negotiating our way into the inside of the buildings. Ultimately, the ones that proved most successful were those where we got to interview the hospital management and staff. We saw, in some of these places, someone mentioned, having tea with the facility, and we certainly had those experiences where we would stay at a facility for a couple hours, getting the full tour, getting the understanding of what happened from hour one to where we were about 6 weeks after the earthquake. So to speak on building performance, fixed base buildings. Generally, what we saw was that the structural performance of the fixed-base buildings was life-safe or better in terms of that performance characteristic, especially in the newer hospitals. And I wish I had a firm date of when newer was compared to older, but you know, in the last 20 years or so, newer hospitals generally performed well. So this building in the picture here from the outside looks pretty good. You see some window damage. From the inside, you know, it's a much different story. So you plenty of partition ceiling damage that not only caused unsafe environments, but it just broke the confidence of every patient and staff in the hospital. One thing of note in this picture is that some of the windows are broken in the upper stories, and we heard that this was because the patients were trying to find a way out because the corridors were impassable. So there was, to the extent of trying to make like a rope out of bed sheets to get out. We don't know if that was successful or not, but that was the story we were told. Another one in Pazarchik was similarly, brand new hospital, 2020 construction. By all accounts, the structure looked fine, but the hospital was evacuated and was set up. They had to set up a temporary tent structure in the parking lot or in the front of the building. They quickly resumed function in the emergency department, and I think a week later they started to reoccupy the rest of the lower floor, while the upper floors had a full construction crew going through and plastering these walls. So they were replacing marble, they were replacing plaster, they were quickly patching the cracks to rebuild confidence, but in the end, it's subject to the same type of failures in the future. This one in particular, we've got a 2.4 G that came out. We're a little suspicious of that, so some of the geotechnical seismologist friends can help us see if that's true. Some more examples of non-structural damage. Partitions, cladding, ceilings, stairs. Stairs were a big, probably an overlooked item, but if your stairs go, then evacuations are near impossible. Speaking of the seismically isolated buildings, there was a lot of interest in those base isolated buildings. We know that in Turkey, all new large construction hospitals are seismically isolated. This is a great move, and generally these buildings provided operational performance. We saw 3 of them firsthand where we got to look at the isolators. Generally, the isolation system displacements were much smaller than the bearing capacities, and I think this was our first initial observation: is that if a dish is designed for 24 inches of displacement, it moved about this much. And so we're curious of why that is, whether it's a friction-related issue in some of the bearings, or if there's just friction in the system due to moat crossings and other non-structural and other types of components that are crossing that plane. Some of those in particular were more obvious than others. In this picture on the left, the moat was actually filled with gravel. So that one moved about an inch, and you compressed the gravel as much as it could. And unfortunately, it's not going to go much further than that. So we tried to politely inform them that that could be fixed, and we'll see if they take any action on that. The middle one was Adana City Hospital. You can see that the moat details. I presume this experienced very little low ground motion, about 0.1 G. If this got moving farther, we suspect these sidewalks and these moats would have functioned. And there were some other details. You can see this detail of Brett pointing at this flex joint, which has capacity in one direction, but not really in the elongation direction here. So speaking of the functional recovery, we did notice that there's this hierarchy of needs. First, the building needs to be structurally safe, and that's sort of a given. That's the first barrier that needs to be achieved. And this needs to be confirmed by an engineer or a building official. There were plenty of buildings where people evacuated the building because they were unsure, and the time it took to inspect the building or get that okay from somebody was longer than should have been for a hospital as a critical component of the recovery. Secondly, the non-structural systems need to remain sufficiently intact. And there's a functional purpose, but there's also the confidence purpose. So the patients and the staff need to feel safe in the building. Of course, the utilities, the emergency generator, the water service needs to be functional, and there has to be an availability of staff and supplies. Our doctor friend that accompanied us, he pointed out that the staff are victims of the earthquake like the patients are. And and there were cases where there were significant numbers of staff that suffered casualties, and there was a shortage of people who were able to provide care in the hospitals. We understand that supplies ran out quickly. Many places were taking anyone who entered the door to provide stitches, provide casts, provide amputations, and they said they quickly ran out of gauze and the thread and all the parts needed to actually facilitate these types of procedures. So kind of looking ahead and knowing what are the important parts are something that we will take back and look at our practice in California, as well as in the full functional recovery models. So I know we don't have time for questions, but a few more pictures. This generator on the right was a critical piece for this hospital. It ran for 7 days straight. We learned that it provided 25% capacity of the hospital, and the hospital management talked about the challenges in just finding diesel fuel to keep this generator running, but they pulled whatever strings they had to keep it functional. You can see some more pictures of just the interior component damage, which was prevalent, and we have steps to fix the old buildings in California. All the codes in the new buildings require it, but it provides more credibility to why we do this, and that our work is important because we are protecting the community, providing that part of resilience to the community that is so important, and without it, it becomes very evident. So with that, that's the end of the presentation.